Hey guys, it's Haley. Welcome to another bookish video. Obviously, today is a little bit different than a typical video. First of all, I'm in this little setup. It's giving podcast. That's odd. And also, I have a guest with me. So, we're going to go ahead and introduce ourselves. If you don't know, me, hi, you've landed on my channel. I'm Haley. I make book review videos. I mostly read horror and thrillers, and I've dabbled quite a bit in extreme horror these past couple years. And I'm joined with my friend Aspen, who's also a creator.
Hi everyone, I'm Aspen. My channel is Aspen's Archive, and I make bookish videos as well, vlogs, wrap-ups, things like that. I mostly read horror, extreme horror, and thrillers, a lot of the same stuff as Haley. Also dabble a little bit in romance, fantasy, sci-fi.
And of course, Aspen and all of her links will be down below. So, everybody, you've probably heard me mention her, but please make sure to check her out. You guys, we're gathered here today because we want to have a discussion. And that's all we want this to be, is a discussion. Just from the jump, I want to give a disclaimer. We're not trying to shame anyone for reading anything. That's the last thing we want to do, because we wouldn't want to be shamed for anything that we read. And we tend to read some taboo stuff. We both read dark romance. We both read a lot of extreme horror and enjoy it. We love and support the genre, but we feel like we wanted to open up a discussion about extreme horror because we've had multiple private conversations about how it's approaching a line. Just the genre as a whole is approaching a line that feels disturbing. So, this is going to be a two-part discussion. You have landed in part one, and we're going to be talking about the more negative, more argumentative, you could say, parts of the discussion over on my channel. And then we're going to be taking a more positive outlook, talking about the pros of extreme horror as a genre on Aspen's channel. So please go follow up and watch that video. Do not just watch this and angry comment. We love the genre, and we're going to talk about all about why we love extreme horror, but not over here. Over here, we, again, just want to open up a dialogue about the ethics of the genre, the content, the people who are a part of the extreme horror community, because we're seeing some disturbing themes. And this is in no way intended to bash anyone or start any arguments. I know it's going to be taken that way because that's just the nature of the internet, but that is not our intention. So, just kind of that disclaimer from the jump. Please keep it civil in the comments. Literally, our only intention is to open up a more nuanced conversation because we haven't heard anyone discuss anything really about the extreme horror genre without being immediately shut down. I feel like that's a common theme, and we will definitely get into that. But I hope it's an interesting conversation and a thought-provoking discussion for any of those who want to read extreme horror. Maybe you already are, even if you've never heard of the genre before. Hopefully you get some kind of curiosity from this video. So, as I said, although we're mostly going to be discussing the dangers of the genre, or what we perceive as things that could be dangerous, we obviously see positives to the genre. We've both individually gotten something out of the genre. We continue to read it. This is not a situation where you can just say, oh, the genre is not for you. Don't read it. Shut up, girls. Like, we genuinely love the genre. I think it's a valid genre. There are definitely positive reasons to engage with dark and disturbing content. It can be really cathartic. It can be healthy, but there are some ways where it's looking unhealthy, at least to us. So we're just going to be discussing that more in depth, all the positive pieces over on Aspen's channel. Head over there. With that said, let's go ahead and get into the more negative pieces. As a mental health professional, I want to begin with the most obvious take, and don't let me get too clinical. Aspen, please chime in as like a, I don't know, a patron of therapy's view at any point. But just as a professional, it can be dangerous to process trauma this way. I mean, I have to acknowledge that. Engaging with extreme horror can be triggering at the very, very least, and re traumatizing at its most reckless. And there are even some forms of therapy that can be re traumatizing, even really wonderful forms of therapy that can be re traumatizing. So, with that said, people can be hurt by the genre, and to say that it's not going to happen is not true. Like, I know most people, myself included, are drawn to the genre because the dark feels familiar, right? We've experienced trauma, so the events described in extreme horror feels familiar. It's not something that is super overwhelming because we've already experienced it. But that doesn't mean that this is not harmful, right? Re traumatization can occur even in a gentle therapeutic space, as I mentioned. So it's a real possibility. And no one is bad or wrong. I want to say that too. Like, no one is bad for engaging in unhealthy coping. Okay, so let's say engaging with extreme horror, reading this is totally unhealthy and it's just not the ideal way to process trauma. Probably true, but also, like, it doesn't mean you're a bad person, and I'm in no way saying that. It just means that we can't really predict what might activate old wounds. So there needs to be some kind of level of consideration. So you're allowed to engage in unhealthy coping if you want to do that. But on my channel, as a mental health professional, I feel like I cannot promote it or enable it. Like, that's just where I stand ethically. Like, there's a line that I have to draw, and that is kind of what led me to wanting to have this discussion in the first place. And I think beyond even the material of extreme horror, if we like completely take all the literature out of it, just the community itself can be toxic. Like, I think we've both experienced this. It feels like an echo chamber a lot of the time. And that's one of the big reasons why we wanted to make this video. Like, virtually every other genre is able to hold space for criticism, for nuanced conversation. I mean, just think of like book Twitter. It's a terrifying place because literally every genre gets attacked. Like, there's no one that gets away unscathed. And I feel like most genres of like most communities of different genres are really good at like just taking a step back and noticing what other people have to say. But if you bring that, like any type of criticism, into a extreme horror space, like, you're attacked, you're blackballed, you're done. Like, no one's going to want to be your friend. Nobody wants to have a conversation with you. You're getting unfollowed. I mean, at least that's my experience. What has been your experience with that?
My experience with it is generally the second you have anything kind of negative or even just critical, not even full on bashing or anything of the sort, you're often told to just shut up, be quiet, don't say it out loud. And I think it's because the genre is really dominated by these smaller authors, they're indie published. It's just a very niche, very small genre. And I think any kind of criticism is often seen as you trying to take it down. And
Mm-hmm.
as people who read and enjoy the genre and who support it, that's never the intention, but there's always space for conversation. There's always space for opinions. There's always space for nuance. Nothing is perfect 100% of the time. And the fact that it's become this space where you can't even have a slightly negative or critical opinion without being told to just be quiet about it, it becomes a really negative feeling. It becomes a space you don't want to be a part of because it just feels like your opinion isn't valid unless you are just going to sit there and go 100% I'm on your side no matter what you do. We all have to have boundaries. We all have to have limits. There's always going to be things that will make someone feel uncomfortable that might not make someone else. That doesn't mean that their opinion or their thoughts on it should just be silenced because they don't agree with the majority.
Exactly. We are we have not been willingly silent on this topic. We've been silenced. Like, it's active silencing. Like, I feel like especially when you get an arc, it's so intimidating to like let your review out there because the community of people, of like reviewers and authors, are the first people to see it. And I've seen people like not enjoy a book. My fellow reviewers have gotten arcs of extreme horror books, not enjoyed it, and felt so pressured that they give it 4 stars. or even 5 stars, because it's terrifying. It is literally terrifying to come out and say anything slightly negative. I mean, look at the Goodreads reviews of some of these horror books. It's so ridiculous that it'll be a 4-star rating, so it doesn't hurt the rating of the book, but then you actually read the review and it's like tearing it apart. Not even like
Mm,
tearing it apart, but it's bringing up a lot of like valid negative points, but they don't factor it into their star rating because they're so scared of hurting these poor indie authors' feelings. Like, I'm sorry, the indie published market is so oversaturated. There has to be some type of rating system. Like, just because you're independently published doesn't mean I'm gonna lie about my review. Like, as a reviewer, first and foremost, my audience comes first. I don't want my audience to spend $12 on your shitty Amazon paperback if it's not worth it. So I'm not going to give it 4 stars. I think the biggest piece of extreme horror that originally stood out to me, just like a theme that I saw in the genre that was very disturbing to me, was the use of just like ridiculous slurs that, like, if anyone used in any other context, you'd literally be canceled, and rightfully so. Right? But it's just like accepted in extreme horror. This was so disturbing to me. Last year was the first time that I came across that type of content in an extreme horror book, and it's when I was reading Womb by Duncan Ralston, and I think my review is like pretty infamous at this point. It's been passed around the little Facebook groups and they've all been having their little opinions on me. Here's the thing, I gave the book 3.5 out of 5 stars. I don't think it's a bad book. I think the horror is really effective, and I didn't have an issue with the plot. I had an issue that a white author is using the N word. And I spoke about that. Granted, I did it in a rant review format, which debatably was not the most eloquent way to say it, but I am a young woman and I'm very impassioned and I don't have to apologize for that. So I had mentioned that in my review, and I was just attacked. Like, when I'm telling you, like, pictures of my face were screenshotted from my social media, my personal social media, and edited, so I was looked like I was mutilated and defecated upon. Like, that is not an appropriate reaction to any reviewer, no matter what rating they give you, but definitely not a 3.5 out of 5 star. Like, that was just absolutely insane to me. And it was literally just one critique about the use of the N word through a white author's words, which are white words, which I think is problematic. Here's the thing, I'm a white person. At the end of the day, my opinion does not really matter, but I'm advocating, right? I'm being an ally. I have seen many clients in practice who deal with trauma just based on racial trauma and the racism that they've experienced. So the thing is, whether you're using it in an extreme horror context or not, like, to me, it's just an excuse to use the word, and it's a flimsy excuse at that, and it's going to trigger racial trauma. And if these people had some kind of purpose behind it, right? If Duncan Ralston said, trigger warning, there's going to be a white person using the N word, or even if it's a black character written by a white person, like, at the end of the day, this is a white person's words that are going to be using this inappropriate slur. If there was some type of trigger warning, then people with racial trauma could go in knowing what they can kind of prepare for or avoid it at all costs. I personally would have avoided it at all costs because it just gives me the ick. It doesn't trigger any racial trauma for me, obviously. But the response from the community, from me just saying that, just blew me away. Like, no one in the extreme horror community was on my side, and I was shook. I was shook. Like, can you imagine if a fantasy author did this? Like, can you imagine if Sarah J. Maas, all these fantasy authors that get dragged across Twitter for anything, and I don't know anything about the drama, so I can't speak on whether it's valid criticism or not, but if one of those fantasy authors used the N word, whether it was said by a white or black character in their novel, they would be absolutely eviscerated. Even in the, like, popular horror spaces. Like Stephen King gets eviscerated for his use of slurs in the early 2000s when it was still fucking horrible, but also like more widely accepted. Yet these people in the extreme horror genre, like, they feel untouchable. Like they have some kind of immunity because they can just stick the "it's extreme" stamp on it. And I'm sorry, I think that's fucked up.
And I don't feel like it serves any purpose. Like, it's never even kinda like you said, it's never once the thing that makes the content extreme. And that's where it feels so completely unnecessary because reading that or putting those words in are only gonna trigger readers, but it doesn't add to the extremeness of the
Mm-hmm.
content. For me personally, I can't speak for other people, but there have been words used that have triggered me before, and I think about it as that adds nothing to the story. It doesn't make it extreme. Its only purpose is this was a lane where I felt like I could use this word and get away with it, so I just threw it in there. They never matter to the story. They don't make it more extreme. They serve zero purpose. They could be completely eliminated, and your book is going to be the same level of extreme as it was when you started.
Right.
It doesn't need to be there.
Totally. It would be like, I could kind of see it. This is the only context where I could kind of see it making sense. If there was just this white author that got it in their head they were going to be king of the allies, and they wrote like some kind of revenge story about this person of color that's like completely unhinged and like going on this rampage murdering everyone that was ever racist towards them. Like if they were giving background, maybe I could see to show the extent
Mhm.
of their trauma, but it's not like it's doing anything. Like you said, it's just to
Yeah.
get away with it.
Another thing that I feel like is important to mention when it comes to the extreme horror community is that I feel like if you are reviewing virtually any other genre or subgenre, I can't say 100% because I might not be in that niche, but for the most part, if you are only reviewing mainstream books, for example, you never have to worry about those authors seeing your reviews or contacting you personally. Or maybe I shouldn't say never, but probably almost never,
Almost
unless
never.
you're some massive giant channel, right? But in extreme horror, it is extremely common for these authors to watch for reviews, to contact their readers. Like the example, I think a great example is my channel. I had an extreme horror author see a video of mine when I had less than 100 subscribers.
God.
That is insanity.
They
That's crazy.
have to be
The video
searching for
had like
themselves. Like they're sitting in their basement
had like
searching for
40
themselves.
Yeah, the video had like 40 views at the time. I mean, it's just unheard of, really, I feel like in any other space. And I can see where this potentially started with like good intentions
Right.
because the extreme horror community was very small, especially a few years ago when it started to be more popular that some other creators were talking about it online. It was tiny. So I can see where the intention comes from of connecting with your readers, wanting to like let people know, hey, I see you supporting me. I appreciate that. I can see where the intention can be positive, but it also creates this really like it fogs the whole thing because as soon as you're trying to befriend these people and you're contacting them personally and I know that these people are watching me, it becomes extremely difficult, at least for me personally, to feel comfortable being 100% honest. Like we were
Mhm.
talking about a little bit before. Like I've had people in my DMs going, "We're watching. We see your videos." And it's like, "Oh my god, can I even say this? Are they going to be you just don't know how people will interpret things. Now they're kind of your friend and if you don't love the book, is it going to blow up when in any other space you don't have to worry about that?" And I could have my favorite author in the world where I love 99% of their work. They're probably someday gonna write a book I don't love.
Right.
And if I can won't feel comfortable talking about that, I feel like we've crossed a line where it's no longer an appropriate relationship if I can't be 100% honest when I'm reviewing a book online because I'm afraid of the repercussions because these relationships are developing to be more than just author reviewer. And the purpose of reviews is for readers. It is for me to tell people what I think is and is not worth their time. it's not me trying to befriend an author. I've
Mhm.
said from day one, I think I've told Haley this, I've told a lot of people this, like, I never want to be friends with anyone because it, as my little people pleasing self, it will be extremely difficult for me to be honest if I don't love every book when I know that that person is watching me, when I know that person is relying on me to keep boosting their content. Not that I'm boosting anybody, but you know what I mean.
But
To
you
keep
are.
positively reviewing things like that. I mean, it's just, it makes it so hard to be honest, and it gets really frustrating to think like if I weren't talking about extreme horror, this wouldn't even have crossed my mind. When I
Mhm.
started my channel, I never even prepared myself for the possibility of an author watching a video because I just didn't even think it would ever happen. And now it's like I don't even like to talk about any extreme horror sometimes because I also know that they're all friends. So
Mhm.
they talk to each other. They, and it's like what it might not be their book, but it could be a friend of theirs book that I don't like. And the intention when I don't like a book and when I review it with criticism or negatively is not against the author. It's
Mhm.
just against that one particular book. And it's never me bringing an author down. But when they feel like they have a personal connection to you, I think it's hard to keep that professional divide of it's just my art, it's just this piece of work. It just wasn't for them because reading is subjective. Everybody's opinion is different. And now it's like my friend doesn't like me. My friend
Mhm.
doesn't think I'm a good author. And I just don't think that that's a healthy space to be in as a reviewer or as an author.
And no matter how big your channel is, like you mentioned, you don't know if you have that level of pull. You are influencing someone, right? The video that got 40 views, those 40 people made a decision based on your video. Am I going to engage with this book or not? Even if it was just a small thing that you mentioned that they're like, well, I don't like that. That's something. And that's what booktube is for. That's why I started watching booktube because I was so overwhelmed with my massive TBR that I'm like, I gotta find a way to prioritize things. And I would like to think that we're both successful to an extent, like have some kind of platform because people feel like they can trust us, and I would not want to jeopardize that in any way, shape, or form. And you're totally right about like the echo chamber nature of it all. Like when I gave Duncan Ralston's book 3.5 out of 5 stars, which is just crazy to say, like I gave it 3.5 and all of this happened. Multiple other authors that I had positive relationships with that I liked every single one of their books unfollowed me, spoke out against me on Twitter, had things to say about me on Facebook, like all this stuff. Like, are you actually kidding? Like, because I'm pretty sure if I talk shit about like a Jennifer Hillier book, and Jennifer Hillier and Riley Sager like always reference each other in their books. If I talk shit about a Jennifer Hillier book, which will never happen, Riley Sager would not all of a sudden be up in arms about me. Like they can take some type of literary critique and separate themselves from their art. But I think in this like you said, indie publish, like everyone's so small in this kind of community, they can't separate themselves from their art. When I'm saying this book is fucking icky, it's giving me incel vibes, they're immediately hearing I'm calling this person who I've literally never met in my life an incel when I'm literally just saying this book is giving incel. Like, I would recommend this for incels. Just like if I'm reading a book with an unhinged woman in it, I'm going to be like, I would recommend this to unhinged women. That doesn't mean that I know every single reader out there and I know that they're unhinged and what that means about them. Like, there's just no separation for this type of community. And that kind of leads into the next thing that we wanted to talk about is like there's a distinction for me and for Aspen as well, because we've talked about this privately, between how the story of what is written on the page makes us feel versus how the author's voice can make us feel. And I think this is like the tricky part
Mhm.
because you really have to look at the subtext, and because it's not written out point blank period like the content of the story is, these authors can just say like, well, that wasn't in my intention, and kind of gaslight mostly women out of saying like, I felt like this paragraph was misogynistic, or I felt some kind of ick during this thing. And I hate using that word. I feel like it's so cringy, but it's the best way that I can describe it is like the ick feeling. I don't know. How would you describe
Mhm.
the ick feeling?
For me, it's like I just will get this pit in my stomach when I read something where all of a sudden it's like an instinctual body reaction that I'll have where all of a sudden I get this internal feeling, like I can feel it
Mm-hmm.
sitting in my chest, and I just go, it's not just the book that made me feel this way. And I mean, I know we've talked about it before where I've tried to explain something to you of like, I don't know why I feel this way. It's just a feeling. And it's like we get what each other means when we say that. We know what that feeling is. I think a lot of people do, but they just don't know how to describe it. And I would say I feel it in my body.
Me
I
too.
feel a physical reaction to it that triggers my brain to go, okay, this isn't just what I'm reading right now. Something else is bothering me here.
Yes. And I can already hear the people in the comments saying, well, they're just triggered. That's called they're getting triggered. They're activated. Da, 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 da. I'm a trauma therapist. Okay. And not only that, I'm a somatic therapist. I know when my body is activated by trauma. This is not that. I also know the difference between the disturbing feeling of horror, right? When you get like the goosebumps feeling that horror is really effective and it can be enjoyable, it can be cathartic. It's why I read horror like pretty much 24/7. I know the difference between that and the discomfort of being taken out of a fictional story and feeling like I'm hearing the author's thoughts through the novel. And that is the ick feeling for me. For example, I've read multiple extreme horror books that cover the same exact material, almost shot for shot, same scenes, even like same interactions between the characters, same stakes, same depravity, same level of description. It's the exact same. If one thing was going to trigger me, then they both were. But one icked me out and one did not. And I have found that the difference is that one leaves me in the world of the book. I'm still feeling for the characters. I'm still in the world of the book and thinking about the meaning and the extrapolations and, everything you want to think about when you're reading. And the other one, the icky one, pulls me out of the fiction into how the author not only perceives their characters and the story, but how they might perceive other people that are similar to their characters. And I'm not saying that all men portray women horribly, but I have noticed a trend that when I read from female extreme horror authors, I get that ick feeling a lot less, if at all. Like I can't even remember a time when I've gotten that feeling reading from a female author. So for me, it really is like the covert misogyny of it all. And it's not all male authors. Like there are some male authors that we're gonna recommend and really raise up and sing their praises over on Aspen's channel in part 2, but there are also some that are just really exceedingly problematic. And if I'm reading every single book by a guy and I'm getting that same feeling every time, it's telling me something about their voice, about their perspective, and not about the story. So, next little part that we want to discuss is the trend. Okay, there are trends in every genre, just like we see like a real tropiness happening in romance and rom-coms. Like everybody wants to put all the tropes and whatever. In thrillers, it's like podcast elements. We see these little trends in every genre, but it's a real disturbing trend going on over in the extreme horror genre. And it's like the competition aspect, which I don't really think this exists. I can't think of a parallel, at least in any other subgenre, but it's kind of like who can be the most extreme. And it's less about the story and what it means and the content, even like the plot, a book, the plot. That's like kind of the thing you're supposed to have. It's not about that anymore. It's about who can just be the most extreme and just like say the most extreme shit. And it's giving like 15-year-old edgelord boy in the back of the class who's just penis like yelling. Like it's just nothing. Like it's just a whole lot of thing. But that trend, while we're like laughing about it, it's really freaky, because what we've noticed is that it's leading towards the violence in these extreme horror books being perpetrated against younger and younger and younger, increasingly younger victims, and more sexual violence in the stories. And I'm just sitting here wondering, like, where have all the slashers gone? Me personally, I love a good slasher. I have slasher recommendations on my channel. I love things like Camp Slaughter by Sergio Gomez, Night of the Prowler by John Athan. Wonderful, wonderful slasher. It is super extreme, awesome gore, darkly funny. Love it. There is also sexual content in there, but again, it didn't give me the ick. And the younger victims and the like extreme level of sexual depravity is just really showing itself lately. And I think I'm not going to attribute it all to one book, but certainly there's one book published, is it published, recently, that has caused big waves, kind of in reference to this trend. Now, I haven't read this book, so I'm going to kind of take a back seat here and let Aspen tell you a little bit about her experience with this.
So, if you're part of the extreme horror community or you follow people who are, you might have heard of a book that was pretty infamous because it was basically banned across the internet and can only be sold through the author's private Etsy shop. The book is called Hub by Matt Shaw, and I have read this book. Unfortunately, I wish I had not, but without getting too much into the actual specifics of the book because I don't want to promote it in any way, but basically it's just a book about a orphanage that trains children to be adopted by really not good people, which is going to be very vague, but you're going to prefer it that way, I promise. When I went into this book, I was the person, and we're going to talk about this in a bit, but I was the person who was no limits, nothing can bother me. I've never been bothered. I didn't even consider what I was getting into. I didn't know a lot about it, honestly. I had just seen a few whisperings and I was like kind of drawn in by this idea of, oh, this book that can't even be on Amazon. What's going on? As a perpetually curious extreme horror reader, I wanted to be in the know. So I read the book and I cried the entire time I read the book. I have recounted my experience to Haley, to other people, and it's really, really difficult for me to talk about it without even crying because it's the first time I read a book that horrific with no purpose. The entire book exists to abuse literal children, like toddler to 10 years old. And it's not a short book. I can't even explain the extents and the lengths that the book goes to properly. Like there's no way for me to tell you how far this book goes.
And I think it's really important that what you just said, like, it's not the norm, right? Because there are other
Mhm.
books that discuss child abuse that
Mhm.
aren't 350 pages long. Most extreme horror books are not 350 pages long. They're under 100, maybe 200, maybe 250 pages. But 300 pages is beyond gratuitous.
Well, and to add to that, the books that we have read both that have covered a similar topic or a similar idea have a purpose.
Mhm.
Like there's a reason that that story is told outside of the abuse that's taking place. And this book, I think, was a massive turning point for me. I think you can see it if you're someone who's followed my content and my vlogs. I think you can see the internal struggle I've been having with extreme horror since reading this book because it really made me sit and reevaluate. It's the first time I ever actually had to sit with myself and wonder if I could even promote extreme horror content ever again because I felt so disturbed by what had happened. And I will take that, this book is labeled it's trigger warninged as what it is, but and I was triggered by this book. I can take that 1000%, but I don't believe this book needs to exist. Not because I personally was triggered, but because the content as a whole, the reaction as a whole from a lot of people that are going to, this book does not need to exist. And the way that I have thought about this book and other extreme horror that I've read since then, and just extreme horror in general, is extreme horror is 100% geared towards adults. There's no question about that fact. So I have come to the point of feeling like, why do we need our main victims, our characters, to be children? Not even teenagers, literal toddlers and just young kids. Why? I mean, think about the power dynamic of it's all adults just reading this abuse against children, and we're exploiting childhood innocence for shock value. And it doesn't need to happen. If you look at any extreme horror book, for the most part, that involves children, the same book could be rewritten with a character of 18 plus, and you would get the same thing out of the story, other than the initial shock of, oh my gosh, how young is this character?
A great example of someone who shed light and actually had something to say with the child abuse content is John Athan with The Groomer. And I know John Athan kind of got like bullied off the internet when he wrote The Groomer. I think that is completely horrible and incorrect. John Athan does a lot of research on what he chooses to write about. I've heard that he bases his plots off of real news stories, things that are happening, things that need to be talked about, things that a lot of people tend to shy away from because it is scary and it is overwhelming to think about it being real. He puts it in a fictional context to talk about the effects that this is actually happening. He did that with The Groomer and Into the Wolves Den. I gave both of those books 4 and 4.5 stars, respectively. I think they are great. I never at any point got that ick feeling. But even just hearing what happened in Hub or watching spoiler vlogs, I can just tell that it was a totally different thing. And again, take this with a grain of salt because I did not read the book, but it feels entirely different. It's also extremely disturbing to hear reviewers giving spoilers of this book and even just talking about this book in general with a smile on their faces. If it's an I can't believe this is happening, I'm so uncomfortable smile, that's one thing, but it feels gratuitous. It is gratuitous joy to be talking about child abuse. It boggles my mind that you can sit there and smile and laugh about a book that, like, you're saying these things that are happening and you're smiling and laughing. It blows my mind.
I think kind of my last thing about this book and kind of in general what I would like authors to ask themselves going forward is, if the only way to make your book extreme is to put all of the violence towards young children, I think we need to be asking why that book even needs to exist in the first place. And I also want to say, just to the wider majority and the extreme horror community as a whole, because I feel like this is coming back to this echo chamber we talk about and this shutting down of any criticism or negative review, that we do not have to support it just because it exists in the extreme horror
Right.
space. Everything has a limit. This idea that nothing is off limits is ridiculous. And I feel like a lot of times people just support things because it's labeled extreme horror. I don't even feel like it is extreme horror. Like, this is something entirely of its own, but it's slapped under this genre because everything's acceptable and people go forward with it and they promote it. And it drives me crazy that we can't see reason and we can't see what's being done with this content and the damage that it's causing and just the societal impacts. Take it out of extreme horror land. Explain to any person who doesn't read extreme horror what this book is about and not feel immense shame and disgust that you've consumed that content.
Mm-hmm.
And what would the reaction be from people outside of this community? It doesn't need to exist. The narrative that everything's fine, it's extreme horror. If you can't handle it, don't read it. Needs to die. There is a line. We don't need to be abusing and torturing children for an entirely adult audience to get a laugh out of it.
Hello. If it seems like the vibe switched, it's probably because it did. We took a little break. We were just gabbing the house down, because that was a lot. That was a lot, and now we're gonna jump right back into it being a lot, because here's the thing: with seeing books like Hub being published more and more often, right? This trend towards who can be the most extreme. I have seen people on booktube and in forums across the internet, Facebook, Reddit, etc., refer to extreme horror as erotica. um Extreme horror erotica does exist, right? If you're looking at something like dark romance that's really, really gratuitous, or something like Toxic Love by Christopher Triana, those are just a couple of examples that would fall into that category. The issue for me is when people are asking on platforms for extreme horror erotica recommendations, and I'm seeing comments from people recommending books with child abuse. So here's the issue of, is this CP? Is this child? If you are calling a book that features abuse, sexual abuse of children, erotica, you're a predator. Like, to me, that's a line that I'm willing to draw hard in the sand. And even without the inclusion of children, if there's just a book that's like rape of a woman repeatedly, torture of a woman for 160 pages straight, even if it's something that's not giving me the icky feeling, like Lovesick by John Ethan, love that book, it's not erotica. It's not. It's just
Mm,
a woman being tortured. So if you're calling it erotica, that's where I have like concerns about the community and how we're looking at these certain forms of literature. It feels kind of weird to call it literature, but it
yeah.
is literature. And I don't think the literature itself is bad. Like I said, love Lovesick by John Ethan, but it's not erotica. And if you think it's erotica, I have a lot of questions about you. And there's also weirdness that enters the realm of my world when it feels like there are rape fantasies put on the page by extreme horror authors, especially when their books involve people that could be real, people in real life. I don't know anything about this from a personal standpoint, right? To my knowledge, nobody has put me as a character in their extreme horror book. I hope it never happens. Please don't do this. And you know what, guys? They're probably going to take that as a cue to do that, which just says a lot about them. But I know that it's happened, right? People are used as characters in extreme horror books. That's odd to me. It doesn't sit right. It really doesn't sit right. It might be fine as like an innocent tribute, character namesake, etc., but it's weird to me. And beyond that, beyond like dealing with real people, even if their characters aren't based on real people, the way that these authors have interactions with real people that are startlingly similar to the way that they treat their fictional characters leads me to believe that not all of it's fiction. It feels like a rape fantasy at some point. When I'm reading an author's work and it's describing in detail a disgusting sexual assault, and then on social media, they are messaging about the violent ways that they would like to have sex with me or with someone else. And you know what? People can deny this all day long. I have the screenshots. I'm not going to release them. I'm not trying to ruin anyone's career, but it's disgusting, right? That's disgusting, objectively.
Another thing that I feel like I've noticed, especially when we talk about this trend of being the most extreme and kind of the direction that the genre has taken as a whole, is I feel like it's sort of become a source of pride amongst authors to actively try to traumatize their audience. And I feel like as an author, it shouldn't be your goal to affect someone so negatively with what you're producing that, like, even when they put the book down or they finish, like, their daily life is heavily impacted by what they've read. Me crying myself to sleep over books that I've read, like, I don't feel like that was the initial intention with extreme horror. I feel like the narrative, the point has been lost a little bit. Um, I feel like people enjoy reading extreme horror, even though it is graphic and disgusting at times, but it's giving you a cathartic experience. Again, more that we're going to talk about later, but it can still be enjoyable, even though it's disturbing. But I feel like we've crossed this line into like, I actually want to harm you with this content. I hope this harms you. If you're traumatized, good. That's the point. I hope it ruins your day. And I feel like that should not be the point. I feel like the goal with extreme horror is to provide a space for people to process their trauma, to explore their curiosity, all of the things we're going to talk about, not to cause your readers further trauma. I know that I, up until a few months ago, never went into a book fearing that I was going to be harmed by it. No matter how extreme it was like worst case scenario, I would be a little bit grossed out by something that I read, but as soon as I closed the book, I was done. It was over. I didn't really think about it again. And now some of the experiences I've had have caused me to go into pretty much every newer extreme horror book with a certain level of trepidation because I feel like the intention of that book is to hurt me, not to give me entertainment or a space to process trauma and curiosity and all of the things that are why I actually read extreme horror. I don't read it to further traumatize myself. That's not the purpose, and I feel like if that becomes this overarching theme, people are gonna stop reading.
Right.
Once they're actively being harmed by the content, they're not gonna wanna consume it
Mhm.
anymore.
I totally agree. I feel like people are gonna think like, "Oh, these girls just, like, stumbled into this genre looking for a safe space. They had no idea what they were in for." I want to just reiterate again, this is not that. I've personally read 50 plus extreme horror books. I'm well versed in the genre. Aspen is the same way. We have been reading this stuff for a long time. We both make content about it. This isn't, oh no, oops, we were triggered one time. It's there's an intention spelled out in the epilogue of, I hope I ruined
Mhm.
your day. I hope that I traumatized you. And just like ethically, morally, our opinion, you can disagree with it. That sucks. Like, we're allowed to have that opinion. Guess
Mhm.
what? It's valid. Um, and it leads me into talking about the misogyny of it all, which is really just the piece that gets under my skin, if you can't tell. There's some
Mhm.
literature, like one of my favorite books of all time, The Last Housewife by Ashley Winstead, They Never Learn by Lane Fargo, things like that, that depict horrible instances of misogyny, of rape culture, of horrible violence against women. But obviously, it's with the intent of shedding light on the subject. I hate, I viscerally hate with every fiber of my body when extreme horror authors stumble their way into misogyny. And then after the fact, when I call them out, I'm like, actually, this was just horrible misogyny. You didn't even think about it twice, the way that this would affect your female readers. And they're like, well, that's the horror of it. You can't just claim that the horror of the world being like the patriarchy was your doing and you invented that. Like, no. It was completely unaware. And that's the thing that gets me with triggers as well. Like, you can never accurately place trigger warnings for misogyny and sexual trauma on a book that's riddled with blindness and unawareness around those necessary triggers, because the only reason why that stuff is in the book is because of the author's bias, right? It's completely unintentional. And this, if it was just in books, would be one thing. But I have firsthand experienced the same authors that I've included in my reviews. There's some misogyny happening here that's not being named, and that's an issue, and it's harmful, and you need to, take a step back and reevaluate. With those same authors that I've taken an issue with their work in that way, I have had personal interactions with them. Again, these people can deny it all they want. They can defend themselves in the comments, whatever. I'm not going to name names because I don't want to be sued. Allegedly, this has happened. I have had interactions where I've been made to feel extremely uncomfortable with these authors. And maybe if I hadn't had those personal interactions with them, I wouldn't feel the same way about the misogyny in their books. I could easily explain it away. But the shitty thing is that I have had those experiences. So it very much colors the way that I see their work. And to call it art is just fucking gross, because the shit that you're saying to me in my DMs is not art, and it's actually gross, and you should have never said it. And if you can't take a step back and think about how you shouldn't have said that in your book, then you're probably not taking a step back and thinking about how you never should have sent me those things. So a lot of men in the comments, I won't use a degrading term here, even if I want to. A lot of men in the comments might be thinking, well, you just don't know your triggers. That's why you got hurt. If misogyny is a trigger for you, then don't read books with misogyny. But it cannot apply here. If authors are not even aware that they might be triggering this thing, they can't warn readers adequately because they don't have the awareness. And beyond that, there are so many female main characters in extreme horror books, and the violence is almost always acted out on women, even when there's a male main character. There are very few extreme horror books with male main characters where the violence is perpetrated upon male victims. Actually, I've seen in forums, Facebook groups, etc., people specifically asking, going out of their way to ask, are there any extreme horror books where the violence happens to men? Because of the over the top abundance of extreme horror books where it's just violence against women the entire way through. And it's not like every single one of these is like, well, there's something to say. No, no. And it's gross. It shouldn't exist, just like Aspen was saying about the CP stuff. These male identifying authors do not understand how women think. It can be way more harmful than healing for women in particular to engage with this kind of material, not because it's too dark, but because it's written with such insidious misogyny that readers might feel further alienated and misunderstood by the material they were looking for comfort and catharsis in. I think that's happened to me. And it's difficult to imagine going to something that has been a comfort to you, which for me has been horror, and thinking you're going to feel that safety and then being smacked on the back of the head with, like, oh, this person who I went to for catharsis actually doesn't understand my perspective at all. And to the women who are listening to this and thinking, well, this doesn't apply to me at all. First of all, congratulations, girly. I really hope they pick you. You can have a good little convo with the incels in the comments. I hope they pick you. And secondly, just because you think internalized misogyny does not affect you does not mean that no one gets hurt from it. If you refuse to see how you're being affected by it, even though you're being affected by it right now, it doesn't mean that I'm not, and Aspen's not, and every other woman who's ever been affected by misogyny is invalid just because you refuse to see it. So what are they going to say next? Can you guess?
Just don't read it if you don't like it.
Just don't read it if you don't like it. That's always what they return to. But here's the thing. We do like it. We do like it when it's done well. There's just no nuance in this argument when they say, okay, don't read it if you don't like it. That is so black and white. That's like reading one book that has urban fantasy and then not liking it, and then the entire fantasy community being like, well, don't read it if you don't like it. Like, nobody's gonna do that. It's just not the book for you, which is fine. And I think it's very, very clear that the books that we're talking about are not the books for us. The thing is, urban fantasy is not hurting anyone, unless something happened on Twitter that I don't know about where people are being harmed. In this instance, people are being harmed. And it's really hard to determine which books are safe for you and which books are not when authors lack depth, awareness, and the presence of any content warnings at all. Oftentimes, a lot of books, especially ebooks like on Kindle Unlimited, which scares me personally because any old person can stumble upon that. I could have stumbled upon it when I was a child on Kindle Unlimited. They don't have any content warnings at all. This genre is not something like romance, where you can avoid books with a certain trope that you might not like. If you hear people say, like, oh, this such and such romance book has an unexpected pregnancy trope, and you don't like that, that triggers you, or it just doesn't sit right with you, you don't enjoy it, you don't read that book. But when these authors lack the awareness to accurately say what is in their book, you can't make that judgment. And even if they do, you can't judge the extent where it's going to go. There's no way to say, well, these are the mid tier extreme horror, these are the extreme extreme, and these are the ultra extreme. There's just not a system like that. Even when triggers are given, you never know what you're going to get.
So, with all of that being said, and I feel like kind of the general consensus of what we're trying to get at with this discussion is that we do believe a line exists in extreme horror or should exist, whether it's being actively talked about or not. And so we thought we would talk about some of our personal limits. I was that person up until a few months ago that said I had no limits, nothing could bother me. I was never going to read anything that was too extreme. And as I've discussed, I've obviously had an experience that really set me back and made me reevaluate thinking that way. So for me personally, my limit is it's hard to say. I mean, I want to say all things involving children, while I do feel like there are some authors that can approach the conversation differently. And I feel like you can tell when it's being used as an actual story and plot line versus just a victim to take your rage out on. But for the most part, going forward, I definitely feel like I need to actively avoid anything that has characters that are underage children because I just don't see the need for it. I don't feel like it makes my content any more or less extreme. It just makes me feel worse about reading it because I don't feel like as an adult woman, I need to read and process my trauma through the trauma of children.
Yeah, I mean, that's a reasonable line. Like, I don't think anyone's going to argue with that. For me, where's my line? Like you said, it's really hard to say because I want to draw the line at underage victims, but then I think of things like The Groomer and Into the Wolves Den, where it has this beautiful commentary, this really
Mhm,
important commentary about, sex trafficking, child sex trafficking. Um, so I don't want to put that as my limit. I would say like meaningless
mhm.
child abuse content, that is where I would definitely draw a line. But then it's like, how do you know if it's meaningless or not until you get into it? So that's kind of like a vague line that I have in the back of my mind that's hard to think of. Similar with the misogyny, if there's gratuitous sexual violence against women with no seeming commentary at all, I would draw a line there. I think any book that really goes hard into violence against women that's written by a man, I'm just going to go ahead and avoid going forward because of that ick feeling that just continually comes up for me. But it comes up in like weird, insidious places that you wouldn't expect. Like, even in a slasher, like I read Last One Alive by Christopher Ruffty, and like there were over 60 mentions of boobs, breasts, tits, like just any way that you could say it. And that to me is disgusting. Like, I don't want to read that the entire time. I'm just thinking how this author might be perceiving me as a woman with boobs, breasts, tits. Like, it's gross to read about. I don't want to think about being perceived by a man. And that's all you can think about when you are in the shoes of a woman and you're reading how a man perceives a woman, whether it's fictional or not. It's gross. So it's hard to find the line, but those are the kind of limits that I have in mind. Mostly, I feel like meaningless books that are just written for shock value. I'm
Mhm.
going to go ahead and avoid. Something like Broken Dolls, I will never read again. I don't wish to read something like that again. it's definitely not for me. So that's where I kind of draw the line. That was the book for me that I was like, there's a line here, and I'm feeling gross. I buddy read it with a friend who was feeling the same way, and we were both just kind of looking at each other, feeling like we were approaching a place that was no longer fun. Extreme horror. So there's that. And we kind of implore you, viewer, audience, to do the same. Really take a moment and think about where your limit is. And if you think you have no limits, Aspen thought she did. I definitely thought I did. Just take a moment and think about it. Where's your limit? Where's your line? Is it similar to us? Is it not? Maybe it's something different. There are some personal triggers I have that I'm not going to talk about that I've been actively avoiding in extreme horror ever since I started reading it. I will never read a book with one specific theme, and I still haven't. And none of my critiques will ever apply to that because I'll never read about it. And I don't feel fine like sharing about that on the internet. But maybe you have one of those kind of limits, and you're allowed to have that. It's valid. Nobody can take that away from you. And if you're still thinking, yeah, Haley, no, I have no limits, just take a moment and think about what that says about you. No judgment at all. I want you to think about what that says about you. I'm not saying what I think. Aspen's not saying anything. We're just going to give you some time for soul searching. So make your own judgments, take your own thoughts into account. And we're going to move on to our next point. So, obviously, we would hope that any authors in the extreme genre listening to this discussion would kind of take pointers, right? Take point of view from, I don't know. I don't even want to say, I don't want to say queer women. I don't want to say women in general. I don't want to say anything about that. Just like a reader or two readers, like I would hope that they would give us some type of credence, jump scare credence, um, to what we're saying. But it's really difficult to actually sit there and give credence to the things that we're saying when it feels like a competition to release books faster and faster and faster and faster. And extreme horror authors kind of get off on this. I wrote a book in this short amount of time, and isn't that great? And it's a competition, like how fast can we write a book? But when books are rushed like that, it really shows. Like you can tell when there's not adequate editing happening with your art. I don't understand why you wouldn't want to take the adequate amount of time to sit there with your art and perfect it and make it beautiful. No other genre really does this. Like, it's not a flex in any other literary space to not give literature the proper time, care, and consideration it deserves. Books are not churned out in 10 days in any other space, I think.
No. There was just recently a situation with a fantasy author who, after publishing her most recent book, kind of put out a statement basically saying, like, hey, this is the fastest I've ever written a book. I believe she said she wrote the entire thing in about a month, which is still significantly longer than a lot of what we see in the extreme horror community. But
Mm-hmm.
she was kind of talking to her readers about the process and how she was super proud of how fast she had written her book. And the response from the community was basically, yeah, we could tell, and please don't ever do it again. They were not happy to hear that. They were not pleased or impressed. The response was, we can tell that you didn't put enough thought and effort into this work, and it shows in your content. It shows compared to previous books how underdeveloped and just how inadequate this one is compared to that. And they basically said, if you are going to do it again, never tell us about it because we don't want to know that. It's not important to us as readers that you're rushing through your work just to get it out there. And I feel like when I heard about that situation, it was so interesting to me because I often see pretty much only praise on the extreme horror side for this idea. And I just think it's really interesting to kind of draw a parallel to another literary space, still talking about books, still talking about authors, and just the extreme difference in how the community responds to something like that, I thought was really interesting. And I think it's
Yeah.
impossible to see problems. Like we talk about
Mhm.
the lack of trigger warnings, the inadequate trigger warnings, just the things that authors maybe don't even notice are a problem, and nobody's really reviewing it with a critical eye. I feel like it's only being reviewed at a surface level, try to get the typos, try to get the grammar errors out, but I don't feel like the content is actually being evaluated with a critical eye, because if
Mhm.
it were, you wouldn't be doing it in that short amount of a time. There's no way you're giving it the proper attention that it needs. At some point, as a reader, it kind of feels cheap and it feels like we're just being used as your funding source, and you know you have these people who are dedicated to you, and so we buy all of your books that come out, and when I know that barely any effort is being put into something and then I read it and it's not great, I just feel cheated out of my money. And I
Mhm.
I don't like feeling like it's just a let's get the next one out the door so I can get money in the bank. Like I if I'm going to spend my hard-earned money on something, I want it to be worth my time.
Totally. And that just goes back to like this community feels like an echo chamber so often, so none of these recurring issues get addressed. I mean, even when I got my mom into extreme horror, my mom loves extreme content. She will go harder into things than I will. Like, she talk about a woman who has no line. Mom, I don't know what your line is, but it's beyond mine. She likes extreme content, and the issue she had when she started getting into the genre was like there's so many typos, and I even found myself defending it to my mom. I was like, well, that's just how the genre is, and she was baffled. She was like, what? But like every other book uses the right there in the right context, unless it's like, oops, that's a real big oops, the editor didn't catch that mistake. Like, and it happens consistently in this genre to the point where I was like, oh, that should be an expectation
Mhm.
going in, that an author whose job it is to write words uses the wrong there and the wrong your and doesn't know how to capitalize pronoun, like what are they called, proper nouns. Like that's kind of ridiculous.
I know I'm thinking it back to vlogs where I've been like, there were quite a few typos, but that's just how it is. And I'm like, God, we fell into the trap.
We have, it's the echo chamber. It's so easy to fall in, and I hope if you're listening to this thinking, oh god, I'm in the echo chamber, we're not trying to shame you, girl. We've been there, we've broken out, we've been awoken, we're no longer sheep. Please join us. Oh, but here's the bigger issue: book talk. Fuck book talk. I think we can all agree. I hope they use that. I hope that becomes a sound. Fuck book talk. Okay, there's so many issues. I'm not even on TikTok. I haven't been on TikTok in 3 months because there's just so much there. But the unavoidable thing is that extreme horror is blowing up on book talk. So extreme horror has a lot more eyes on it than it ever has. We can't pretend that it's this tiny little community that's so super niche and no one's just going to stumble upon it anymore. When little girlies are sitting there being like, read playground. Like, no, that it's not that. It's kids, it's anyone who scrolls through TikTok, it's one of the million viewers of book talk that's going to stumble upon these books now. And it's so popular to the point where large retailers like Barnes and Noble are seeing this niche as profitable. So there's now extreme content in Barnes and Noble. And I actually didn't know about this until Aspen told me because I haven't been on TikTok. But when she was telling me about this, I was just blown away. Like, in one sense, it's great, right? Like, the TikTok effect on indie authors is wonderful. But it also means a ton of uninformed eyes are going to be on this material with very little, no, or at the very least, inadequate content warning. So, what limits should there be? We don't know. We're not experts. We just want to open a discussion about it. Like, what do y'all think?
Yeah.
Should it be behind the counter? Should there be warning signs? Should there be a velvet rope? Like,
I just Personally, I remember the first trip I took to Barnes& and Noble when I saw those books on the shelves, and I stood there with my mouth hanging open in shock because it was just sandwiched in between everything else. There was no extra sign, and I just think about uninformed people maybe who don't even buy the book, but who just pick it up and open to a random page and what could they see with no warning. And I feel like even if the book does have extreme horror content warnings in the beginning, not everybody flips to that first page. Not everybody's going to see that before they take the book home. And that's what I've been seeing on the TikTok side of things is I think a lot of this conversation started with people buying Playground at the store, not knowing what it was, and there's like a whole trend on TikTok of who can make it past page 47. And it's just opening this really, really crazy discussion and potentially damaging to extreme horror readers and the community because these people are tearing the genre down because they didn't even know it existed and they didn't have the proper warning before they read some of that content. And as someone who's been an extreme horror reader for years, I've always kind of joked like, "Oh, I would kill to have extreme horror in stores. Like it's so frustrating that it's kind of hard to access." But the reality is, it's probably good that it's that hard to find because it makes sure that uninformed people and people who are just unintentionally searching for their next read aren't just going to happen across it accidentally. And that's really important when you're talking about such extreme content. And even if you're looking at adults, not everybody can handle extreme content. So,
Mhm.
but I even think in Barnes and Noble, it's just on a shelf where a child can walk by. Anybody could pick that book up. And so, my personal opinion on it is that if it's going to be sold in stores, it should be kept behind a counter or in its own section where there's a proper warning sign that basically says these books are classified as extreme. If you are not aware of what that is, please do some research on it. Like, don't just pick it up going, oh, this book called Playground sounds fun, and walk home with it if you've never even heard of extreme horror or splatterpunk or anything like that
Mhm.
prior to that Barnes and Noble trip.
Yeah. I mean, I just think of myself as an adolescent going to Barnes& and Noble with my mom, and my mom was like, "It's books, like, what
Mhm.
could possibly hurt her? As long as she's reading, like, woo, go free." She bought me my panini at the Starbucks inside Barnes& and Noble and sent me on my way, and where did I go? Of course I went to horror because I was always a
Mhm.
little horror girl, but I would also stop by the Danielle Steele novels and try to flip until I saw the word pussy on a page, and then I would read
Mhm.
it. Like, that's what adolescents do. They wanna be curious, and we have to protect unassuming children from being like, "Ooh, let me be curious. What is this horror book?" And then being completely traumatized. Or to go back to what I was saying with the slurs, God forbid someone's racial trauma, disability, since the R word is something that these extreme horror authors love to use all the time. God forbid they flip to a page with that. And then they're hit with that in the middle of their fun little book shopping trip. Like, I can't imagine walking into a Barnes and Noble as a child and picking up Playground by Aaron Beauregard without proper warning at all. So obviously, there's some kind of limit that there should be. And if you are an extreme horror reader who loves the community, as we are, and you're sitting there thinking, no, there shouldn't be any limits, Aspen brought up a great point that it protects the genre because unassuming people aren't going to pick it up and then bash it. Unassuming people aren't going to pick it up and then give it a 1-star review to these precious indie authors you guys want to protect so bad. There
Mhm.
should be some kind of regulation there. We're not in charge. Barnes and Noble, do they have a level of responsibility here?
Great question.
I mean, answer in the comments. What do you think? This is all just to start some kind of discussion. So we hope you engage with it. And we have to be louder than the incels in the comments because they will find us. They will find us. Aaron Beauregard is down there. Matt Shaw's down there. They're gonna say some shit, so try to say something productive. I think
Last
the last
section.
thing, yes.
Last section of the negativity.
The
Well, it's not
last thing we
negativity,
want
it's
to talk about.
constructive criticism.
Yes, this is constructive criticism. I think the reason why we're framing it as negativity is because that's the way it's framed when we've tried to voice any of this in the echo chamber in the past.
Hmm.
Um, but the last point we want to get into is the overall level of desensitization that happens when you engage with extreme horror often. And I'm talking like you're reading multiple extreme horror books every month, which I do.
Hmm.
Aspen does. I've talked to other creators that do this, and they've seen the same level of desensitization happening. This is the most disturbing part for me. It's the last thing that we're going to talk about, but for me, it's the worst. It's the hardest for me to talk about because I see it in myself. The more that I engage with the genre, I am unfazed by things that I used to balk
Hmm.
at the beginning. And I feel like that has affected me in some way, right? That's affected my level of humanity or something. And for me, it's not a flex. I think a lot of readers see that as a flex. Like, oh, I'm building up my extreme horror muscle. I can read crazier and crazier and crazier things. Should we want to do that? Should we want to be unfazed? Is that not some kind of erosion of empathy to anyone else? Because to me, that's not a flex. It is completely terrifying, especially as a mental health professional who uses extreme horror to cope with some of the things that I hear at work, because I do work with trauma. Extreme horror has helped me cope with some of the horrible things that I hear, that I have to hold space for, that I am willing to hold space for. But it's terrifying to think that that same thing that brings me comfort and catharsis also strips me of the things that make me good at what I do. That is the last thing that I would ever want. And I don't see it affecting my work yet. I'm going to really bring in those limits so that doesn't happen. But I have seen it affect me on a personal level. And on a less personal level, I'm already anticipating reading defensive comments from desensitized people that at times seem to lack any empathy, compassion, nuanced thought at all. Like, I can already hear those comments in the back of my head because I've read them so much in extreme horror forums, on Facebook pages, etc., etc. I'm in there. I see you. You will never find me. But I'm there and I see your lack of empathy and it disturbs me. It disturbs me. I was talking about this with a fellow creator. We buddy read an extreme horror book together. It's not Aspen. I'm not sitting here talking about her anonymously in front of her. Um, but we were talking about the level of shame that we feel now that we didn't feel at the beginning. And it's because of the desensitization. So think before you comment and defend something like rape, CP, even misogyny. Would you want your employer to know the take that you're defending so hard in the comments? Would you want someone to screenshot that and send it to your boss? Would you want your mom to know? What about your partner? If you're a straight man, especially, would you want your partner to know the things that you're defending? Does your wife know you're defending borderline CP and rape fantasies on the internet? Do they know that? What about your kids? Do you look at your baby after you finish an Aaron Beauregard book and feel good about yourself? I would genuinely like to know. There's no judgment behind that statement. I know you're going to think that there is, but there's not, because I can't get to the point where you're allegedly at. I can't. It strips me of my empathy. It's a level of desensitization that happens. And we even talk about this when you go to school to be a mental health practitioner. We talk about compassion fatigue. It's a real thing when you're holding space for trauma over and over and over, hour after hour, every single day. And obviously, mental health professionals don't have a choice, right? Whatever walks in your door, walks in your door, and you have to take care of yourself and combat that compassion fatigue. And it's something that mental health professionals take very seriously. But there's no ethical code for taking in extreme horror content. So you're not checking your compassion fatigue. It's just not there anymore. What about you, Aspen? How have you seen that level of desensitization in your life, personal, professional, whatever?
I think I see it the most Personally, I see it a lot in just the way that I view the world. I think I've come to this point where my viewpoint of the world is just completely destroyed. And I think a lot of that is because a lot of ideas that have just become very normalized in my brain. And it might not even be some of the really big, obvious things that we see a lot in extreme horror, but sometimes even the smaller things. I know I've had conversations with Haley and with other people talking about books, and they go, "Oh, that thing was just crazy." And I have to sit and have this moment with myself where I go, "I didn't even notice that until it was pointed out to me." And when I have those moments of realization, I feel sad for myself. I feel sad that I've gotten to a point where this is my view of the world, and this is just like what I expect to read and what I expect to happen. And I think a lot of my recent struggle has been having a hard time distinguishing fiction from reality when I consume extreme horror content. So much of it feels very kind of true to real life. And so I think a lot of the ideas that I read in extreme horror can just kind of transfer into how I see the real world, even. And it makes living in the real world scarier. And it makes it just harder for me to interact with the content.
It's just like the hypervigilance, you
Yeah.
know? If you were never aware that a man might be thinking these thoughts about you, and then you read an extreme horror book and multiple extreme horror books where the same villain characters are having the same insidious thoughts, the next time you see someone across the road, you're thinking, are they thinking this thought about me? It never
Yeah.
was introduced into my mind until now, and now it's not fiction, now it's real because we're
Yeah.
women and we
Yeah.
have actual things to feel out in the world.
Yeah. I mean, it's just always such an eye opener for me when I have those conversations where I realize that this massive thing has just completely gone over my head. It didn't even register a second of extra thought because it's become so incredibly normal in my brain for people to be spoken about that way, or for this kind of action to take place, that it just no longer has any impact. I remember reading my very first extreme horror book, and I barely made it past chapter 1, and I just, like, think of little old innocent me that had no idea, and if I could compare that person to who I am now and the way that I think and consume content, I know I'm not even close to the same person that I was when I started reading it. And not in an entirely bad way, but not
Right?
in an entirely good way either.
Yeah. That reminds me of literally earlier today, I was reading Along the River of Flesh by Christopher Triana, which, by the way, I gave 5 stars and it's phenomenal. And if you like extreme horror, you should definitely read it. But I found myself like cringing and having these bodily reactions to these horrifying things. And then hearing like the comments from the community, that like echo chamber in the back of my head saying, like, it's not that bad. Why are you even scared? Like, I was literally gaslighting myself and invalidating myself because I've been in that echo chamber for so long that I was like telling myself I shouldn't be scared of something that's absolutely horrifying and you definitely should be scared of. But that's what happens when you get so deep into this community, is you'll say like, "Oh, this book scared me so bad." And then someone in the comments is like, "That's a beginner extreme horror. You know nothing of the darkness that I've seen." And it's like, "Oh, so that shouldn't be scary?" It's just ridiculous, the level of desensitization that happens. And as long as we talk about it and we name it and we address it, it can be fine. Like, we can
Mm,
still engage with this content. Nobody is telling you we're going to abolish the genre. Nobody should read this. That's the last thing that we're trying to say. It just needs to be talked about. There should be some type of line. Just like in my profession, there's a level of ethical responsibility. When you deal with trauma in any capacity, there should be some kind of level of ethical responsibility. Great. Now that that's out of the way, I feel like I've done my due diligence by inciting some kind of minuscule bit of soul searching. Hopefully, this conversation reached someone out there. Now let's go over to Aspen's channel for part 2 and talk about how extreme horror can be healthy, how it can be positive, the ways that it's affected us positively. We're going to just celebrate the genre that we love, that we're scared of a little bit, that we feel like should have some kind of checks and balances, but at the end of the day, that we really, really love. So thanks so much for watching, guys. I hope this doesn't cause too many waves. I hope it just opens up a nice civil discussion. That is really my genuine hope. So thanks for hanging out. Head over to Aspen's channel for part 2.